If you don't have a vintage lens or two in your lens lineup already, at this point, can you even call yourself a real filmmaker? Vintage lenses are the secret cheat code to getting more organic, cinematic, less digital looking images from your digital camera, just like your favorite films. Not only that, they're affordable, some might even say cheap, and the best way for you to get a full set of cinema style prime lenses for half the price of modern glass. But with so many vintage lenses available on the used market, which offer the best value and quality? I will compare and test two of the best lens sets side by side and then comprehensively discuss their pros and cons, differences, similarities to help you decide which set is worth it for your filmmaking needs. If you're looking for a relatively affordable vintage lens set to complement your camera and bring back some of that organic, analog character to your work, then there are two top contenders: Leica Elmarit R Lenses or the Contax Zeiss lenses. But first, why vintage? Why put an old beat up 40 or 50-year-old manual lens that is full of chromatic aberration, busy bokeh, can't autofocus, and is mediocre in low light on a pristine new digital camera? Well, the key reason is the digital in your digital camera, because actually, vintage lenses are a digital filmmaker's best friend as we move into higher resolution shooting formats like 4K, 6K, 8K, and even 17K apparently. Like a nice whiskey at the end of a hard day's work, we're looking for something just to take the edge off, the digital edge off. Vintage lenses literally take the edges off your insanely over-resolved video. High-resolution filmmaking is a gift and a curse. On the one hand, look at how much detail we have in our image. On the other hand, just look at how much detail we have in our image. Gross. This enhanced resolution is the type of thing that turned the visual cinematic excellence of the Lord of the Rings trilogy into the cinematic visual irrelevance of the Hobbit trilogy. All thanks in part to these new digital sensors. One way to mitigate this over-sharpened unreality of our new cameras is to use vintage lenses. If it's good enough for some of the greatest cinematographers working with the best cameras in Hollywood today, then it's good enough for you and your goofy FX30 footage, you G-Master Sony simp. I have talked about the Leica Elmarit Rs in the past. I have filmed some massive projects with these lenses, including a recent 6-month documentary that took me to 6 different countries across the Pacific. I chose these lenses for their beautiful organic nature and creaminess, which I find complements skin tones and pairs perfectly with my Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K full frame. But just when I thought I had the ultimate set of vintage lenses, a set of Contax Zeiss popped up on the used market that was just a little bit too good to ignore. The Contax Zeiss lenses have a lineage leading directly back to the Zeiss Super Speeds. With a similar coating and optical design, the Zeiss Super Speeds are known as the Kubrick lenses, as they were often favored by Stanley Kubrick in many of his films. And I used a set of these Super Speeds on my first feature film, I Survived a Zombie Holocaust, and I loved the look they produced. So I have a personal connection to these vintage lenses, and for me, the idea of owning the affordable equivalent of these famous classic lenses, which I filmed my first feature on without the 100K price tag, was hugely appealing. My Contax set consists of an 18mm f4, 28mm 2.8, 35 2.8, 50 1.4, 60 2.8 macro, and an 85mm 1.4. You can get an f2 version of the 28mm and a 1.4 version of the 35mm, but the price jumps significantly for the extra stops of light, which is true of many of these vintage lens sets. My Leica lens set includes a 24mm 2.8, 28 2.8, 50 f2, 60 f2.8 macro, and a 90 2.8. My Leicas are the Elmarit versions, the cheapest versions, apart from the 50mm, which is a Summicron. When it comes to picking out a vintage Leica lens set, the serial numbers are an even better indicator of both how much your lens might be worth and what era your Leicas were made. Newer serials in the mid 300,000s will fetch a higher price on eBay and come from the mid 80s and 90s, whereas the 200,000 serials and below will have been made in the 1960s and 70s. Older serials equals a more vintage look. Newer serials will provide a cleaner, more modern look. All of my copies sit probably sometime in the mid to late 1970s. In terms of the cost of each lens, when we look at my versions, you will normally find each lens in both sets between $400 to $1,000 on the used eBay market. Prices fluctuate greatly depending on the condition of the lens, so getting a set will definitely be significantly more expensive than a Contax set. But generally speaking, any one of these lenses will still likely be cheaper than a high quality modern stills lens of the same focal length. And for example, the cost of my entire Contax set was about the same as one of my more expensive zoom lenses. It should be noted that both of these sets have one particular focal length, which is much rarer and more expensive than all the others. Both of them are wider focal lengths, and because wide-angle lenses were much rarer in this period generally, the wide-angle lenses of any vintage set tends to be the highest price. For the Leica Elmarit Rs, it's the 19mm 2.8, and for the Contax, it's the 21mm 2.8, neither of which are part of my collection. Fortunately, the Contax has the 18mm f4, which is no doubt a great, more affordable alternative. For the Leica, the 24mm will have to suffice unless you use a wide-angle converter trick that I'm detailing in another video. While the Leica's focus wheels require a bit more torque to turn, I prefer the stiffness of the Leica's focus wheels, but both feel very good when adjusting focus. They are both all metal constructions and feel very sturdy and robust. Now we've got specs out of the way, let's analyze these side-by-side comparisons across the focal lengths. These were filmed on the Panasonic S5 IIX. The same grade has been applied to each lens with no further adjustments except exposure correction when filming at a lower f-stop with the Contax. And the Contax do have an advantage here, as the 50 and 85mm can stop down to f1.4. Now, to make things more interesting, I decided to run a little scene using both sets of lenses to see how they perform in a filming environment across the different focal lengths. I call this scene "My Hot Wife Practicing the Piano While Sipping Wine." Enjoy. Now we've had a look at the tests and hopefully you have formed an opinion of what you enjoy about the lens sets. For me, after doing these tests, I was surprised by just how similar these lens sets often felt to each other. I thought I would see more apparent differences between the sets, and deciding on a set for yourself is really going to be a matter of your own preferences. But because they do feel similar, if it's one unexpected thing I learned doing these tests is with a touch of grading, you could probably mix lens sets and still have it feel like it was shot on one uniform set, meaning that you could even try mixing and matching between the Leica and the Contax if you were so inclined. I think it's fair to say that the Contax set is sharper, while the Leica set is a little creamier with a smoother highlight roll-off. When you open up the Contax lenses that go below f2.8, the bokeh gets very busy, which is not something I'm much of a fan of. The Leicas, on the other hand, tend to have nicer bokeh throughout the range. The Contax lenses offer a little more contrast, while the Leicas feel a bit more washed out. The Contax seem to have a more neutral color to them, whereas the Leicas have always had this sort of sometimes greenish, sometimes yellowish hue, which is definitely more prominent, but something that I actually like. In terms of standout lenses, I haven't used the Contax enough to really find my favorites, but as I like wider angle lenses, the 18mm f4 is a very interesting lens with a great close focal distance. I also immediately gravitated to the 28mm because of its flexibility, and I also think I prefer the 60mm macro to the 50mm 1.4, at least in my set. For the Leicas, I would say the 24mm and 28mm saw the most amount of use over the course of my recent documentary, and that paired with the 50mm are the lenses I gravitate most to in the set. However, some of those 60mm macro shots were absolutely gorgeous. My personal preference, I think, is still the Leica set, but I do think that the Contax set could be more versatile in how you could use them. Their more neutral color and their sharpness allow them to be used in a wider variety of ways, with their vintage characteristics not being too vintage, while the Leicas have a more distinct style that means their qualities won't fit every application. So perhaps you can factor that into your decision when weighing up between the two. And ultimately, the Contax are quite a lot cheaper. So if your mission is to build the most affordable vintage lens sets, starting with the Contax is probably the way to go. But look, for all their great qualities, vintage lenses do also have some significant drawbacks, and you need to consider some of these cons and difficulties of using a vintage lens set before you decide if this is going to suit you. First, if you want any of these lenses to work on your new camera, you are going to need to cine mod them. That means changing their mounts to match your camera. In my case, I adapted them to EF mounts to allow them to work on almost any camera system. Realistically, you'll also need focus rings to control manual focus quickly and accurately. I would recommend the cine front rings. Most of these manual lenses have tiny and often non-uniform front rings, which make it challenging to find the appropriate sized filters to put on. If you add these cine rings, you can get each lens to take the same size filter or matte box. Many of these lenses, while not zoom lenses, do extend through their focal range, and this is perhaps one of their most annoying traits. Then we have the nature of vintage lenses. They're old.
I'm old, Gandalf. I know I don't look it, but I'm beginning to feel it in my heart.
Things go wrong with old lenses. This could come in the form of stiff or overly loose focus rings, or the aperture itself slipping up or down. It could be haze or grease on the aperture blades, balsam separation, scratches on the coatings, or even the dreaded fungus on the inside of the glass. Good copies of your lens can quickly become bad copies of a lens, and people's assurances that this particular version is in excellent condition, AAA+, quickly give way to, oh, I didn't notice that bit of fungus growing on its inside. Really? You didn't notice that? Look, It's just the nature of the beast. And to be fair, with several of these issues, a vintage lens may function normally despite suffering from a range of these problems. Acquiring these lenses is all a bit of a gamble when you make that purchase off eBay. But in some ways, that's all part of the fun. You can't expect these lenses to perform like modern stills lenses. In fact, you don't want them to. Their inherent softness, chromatic aberration, and propensity for flaring and washing out far too easily in broad daylight are just part and parcel of buying lenses of this, well, of this vintage. So with all that being said, is it worth all that effort just to use these vintage lenses? Well, in my opinion, no, they're not going to suit certain corporate and commercial jobs. Yes, they can be at times painful to use when compared to modern glass, but ultimately it always comes down to the image they produce, and the image they produce feels more organic and natural and less manufactured and less digital. Think of using vintage lenses as part of your film school. So which set did you prefer? Sound off in the comments. Do you have a favorite vintage lens or set that aren't Contax Zeiss or Leica? If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing and hitting that notification bell, because without that bell, I myself will become much like a vintage lens without a modern adapter, sitting lonely on a shelf somewhere gathering dust, unable to show YouTube my imperfect, somewhat aged beauty. And if you want to see me compare my Leica lenses to a series of modern cinema and stills lenses, click on the link beside me. As always, I am the Savage Filmmaker, and I'll see you when I see you.